Yeah, I know I'm doing that on stream, but whatever. Anyway, hello, ladies and gentlemen, Forrest over here, and welcome back to another live stream. We are finally here reading the last sections of Penpal by Dathan Auerbach, and then, like I said before, immediately after, I will be revealing the next book that I will be reading for Halloween. Well, for the month of October that we're going through right now. Because if you didn't know, if you didn't remember, if you don't remember, or were not there when I said so, um, so for those of you who don't know, I've said before that I will be reading horror books or anything of the equivalent leading up to, just because it's the month of Halloween. And I already know exactly which book I want to go after next. Now, I did initially say of another book that's a psychological thriller, but because of how long that book is, I felt like we weren't going to have enough time to go through uh, a certain a certain writer's book. So, the books of at least the book of a certain writer. You probably might know who I'm talking about here, but just in case, I'll keep it a secret until the very end. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get right straight into it. Here is chapters slash sections 5 and 6, the final two sections slash chapters of Pen Pal. Let's begin. Oh yeah, by the way, in case you didn't notice, yeah, we got a bit of a different background this time. Because I felt like, you know what, we're in a reading circle. Let's go right where we got our reading books. Why not, right? But yeah, let's go ahead and get right straight into this. Section slash chapter 5. Screens. At the end of the summer, between kindergarten and first grade, I caught the stomach flu. The sickest I had ever been up to that point was the week in kindergarten that I had been stricken with a sore throat, but the stomach flu was an entirely different challenge. It has all the components of the regular flu, however. With the stomach flu, you threw up into a bucket and not the toilet because you were sitting on it. The sickness gets purged from both ends. I stayed in bed for almost 10 days, and just as it seemed that my body had fought the plague into submission, it was granted an extension, albeit in a different form. One morning, just a day or two before school resumed, I woke up and began to panic, thinking for a moment that I had gone blind. My eyelids were so fused together by the dried mucus generated during the night that I couldn't open them. I had to pry my eyelids apart with my fingers. I had pink eye. When I started first grade, it was with a kink in my neck, caused by more than a week of bed rest and two swollen bloodshot eyes. Either of these things individually might have been manageable, but as I walked through the door and into the school, there was a noticeable quieting in my peers' chatter as they looked at my infected eyes, an awkward, hunched comportment. Josh had been assigned to another group which I had known about for weeks, but eating schedules weren't determined that far in advance. But, I almost said the wrong word there, sorry. It wasn't until my class was brought. I should probably have turned this down a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off. Sorry. Where were we? Oh, yes. It wasn't until my class was brought in. Hold on, let me do this real quick. Actually, hold on. So where you guys can see me read the book here. All right. It wasn't until my class was brought into the lunchroom that I discovered that Josh had also been assigned to a different eating period. So, due to my affliction in the absence of my table mate, and a cafeteria bursting with 200 kids. I still had a table all to myself. It's a bit poetic that it is so easy to take advantage of those who have no advantages to begin with. After the first several days of first grade, I started bringing spare food in my backpack that I would take into the bathroom to eat after lunch, since my school meals were usually confiscated by older kids who knew that I wouldn't stand up to them since no one would stand with me. This dynamic persisted even after my condition cleared up, since no one wants to be friends with the kid who gets bullied, unless they have some of that aggression directed toward themselves. There's an expression that says you have to have money to make money, and while friendship itself is surely priceless, making friends seems to operate by the same rules. The fact that I was relatively personable in class did little to counter the fact that most of my classmates recognized me as the kid who sat alone at lunch. I was unable to make friends in class because I was unable to make friends at lunch, and the opposite held true as well. This loop fed itself for weeks. In kindergarten, most of my peers had grouped off with several friends, rather than pairing off with only one, like I had. This meant that in the first grade it would have been difficult to insert myself into their fold, even if I hadn't been a leper. With no friends, my ability to make any was jeopardized, and as the bullying grew more frequent, potential acquaintances grew more distant. I came to dread going to school in the morning to the point that there was more than one occasion where I cried when I had my alarm clock or when my alarm clock signaled the start of my day. The start of my day. My only reprieve was waiting for the school bus with Josh in the afternoon so that we could discuss our continued navigation of the tributary, but this simply wasn't enough to make the rest of the days bearable. Finally, and unexpectedly, my situation was improved by the intervention of a kid named Alex. Alex was in the third grade, though he was bigger than most of the other kids in any grade at my school. His greater size wasn't just vertical. Alex was fairly overweight. His parents had attempted to hide their son's mass by outfitting him with oversized shirts that buttoned up the front and didn't cling to his body so easily or tightly. However, when he sat down, the fabric would be stressed, and the openings between some of the buttons would burst, which would reveal the fat on his stomach that the baggy shirt was meant to cover. Of course, no one ever pointed this out to Alex. Despite his intimidating size, Alex always seemed nice enough. I never saw him pick on another kid, and he didn't seem to be self-conscious about anything. One of the benefits of not having to worry about being bullied. About 5 minutes into lunch, sometime during the third week of school, he walked up to my table with his tray and sat down. There were several times when it looked as if he was about to say something, but they were always false starts. He left when lunch was over and the process began anew the next day. I was curious as to why he had suddenly decided to sit next to me, but I was hesitant to bring it up. His company had put an immediate end to the shortage of my food supply, and I would be a fool to do anything to jeopardize this new relationship. Ignoring my curiosity, I tried to strike up a conversation with him several times, but he would only ever respond with enough effort to close whatever subject I had broached. I had never spoken with him at length, and so I was having difficulty determining whether he was distracted by something in his thoughts or if he was simply slow. He wasn't being rude in his curt replies, but they left no room for an actual dialogue to develop. Against my better judgment, I confronted him on the third day he sat across from me eating his lunch. He seemed at a loss initially, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew I would ask, but had not yet thought of how he would respond. After fumbling and stammering for a moment, he simply blurted out, he had a crush on Josh's sister, Veronica. Oh, that's interesting. Veronica was in fourth grade and was probably the prettiest girl in the school. Even as a 6-year-old who fully endorsed the notion that girls were disgusting, I still knew how pretty Veronica was. When she was in third grade, Josh told me 2 boys had actually gotten into a physical fight because of her. It erupted out of an argument concerning the significance of the messages she had written in their yearbooks. One of the boys eventually hit the other on the forehead with the corner of one of the yearbooks, and the wound required stitches to close. While not one of those two boys, Alex too wanted her to like him and confessed that he knew that Josh and I were best friends. Although he had difficulty articulating it, probably because it was an embarrassing request, I gathered that he had hoped that I would convey his ostensibly philanthropic deed to Veronica, and that she would presumably be so moved by his selflessness that she'd taken an interest in him. If I talked him up to Veronica, he would continue to sit with me for as long as I needed him to. Because this was during the time when Josh mostly stayed at my house navigating the tributary with me, I didn't have the chance to bring it up to Veronica because I simply didn't see her. Even if I had, I'm not sure what I could have said that would have worked in his favor, aside from simply saying that he was a nice guy. But I needed to convey the message. It seemed like Alex had taken a liking to me and might continue to sit with me, regardless of whether I held up my end of the agreement, but whether or not he realized it, he had done me a tremendous favor, and I wanted to return it. I told Josh about the situation, but he had just made fun of Alex. Part of me understood why Josh found it funny, but I insisted that he talk to Veronica, since Alex had done a nice thing for me. He told me that he would tell his sister because I wanted him to, though I doubted that he would. Josh was annoyed that people seemed to be so taken with his sister. I remember him calling her an ugly crow. I never said anything to Josh, but I remember wanting to say, even then, that Veronica was pretty and would one day be beautiful. I was right. When I was 14, I was a freshman at a high school that was comprised of two distinct populations of students. The majority of the students lived in the district for that school, and they attended it as regular pupils, but there was a small percentage of the student body that commuted to the school to attend a completely separate program with a fundamentally different curriculum that was designed to prepare students for college. I was in this program. The school was located in a predominantly poor area, and as is often the case for whatever reason, this poverty was coexistent with the underperformance of many of the school's general population. Some of these students had full-time jobs by their junior year, while others simply elected not to come to class. As a result, the school as a whole was a failing one. Because the collective grade of the school was an F, its funding from the state had been significantly reduced, which meant that it became more difficult to get the necessary resources to raise the grade of the school. As a last resort out of this true catch-22, my program was placed in the school to raise the overall grade without having to address any of the actual reasons why the school was failing to begin with. I had hoped that the fact that my program attracted kids from all over the city would mean that Josh and I would finally attend the same school again, since it had been 10 years since we were in the same class, not to mention the same school. But there was a good deal of stigma attached to attending a program like this, and so I understood why Josh apparently decided to attend his district school. Other kids from my first elementary school, however, had made different choices. For the most part, this common origin didn't translate into easier conversation like I had expected it might, but it did allow me to befriend someone from my elementary school that I hadn't actually known that well when I was a kid, though I remembered him very distinctly. When I saw him, I recognized him immediately, although his hair was longer than it had been back then. His face hadn't changed that much, and I could still picture him crying and pouting after our kindergarten teacher scolded him for releasing his balloon too early. It was Chris. He had apparently forgotten about that episode, and when I brought it up, he attempted to deny it coolly, but laughed so hard that he completely confirmed it. The memory of him clutching the empty air with his tight fist, held just out of the frame of the class photograph, catalyzed a fit of laughter in the both of us. I got to know him and his friends, Ryan and Adam, fairly well. We didn't have that much in common in the end, but we had similar senses of humor, and we all liked movies. That was enough. As a result of our one common interest, we had taken to frequenting special screenings of old movies at a place he had come to call the Dirt Theater. It was probably nice at some point, but time and neglect had weathered the place severely. I'm not sure if the building was built as a theater or if it had been repurposed. The floors were level, and rather than rows of fixed seats, There were movable tables and chairs. This latter fact was actually the attempted selling point of the business. Their portable furniture was featured in every commercial and advertisement. The interior layout was so bad that when their theater was even partially full, there were very few places you could sit and see the whole screen. In some of the theaters, there were actually support columns in the middle of the room that blocked the entire portions of the screen if you were unlucky enough to sit anywhere behind them. Despite all this, that theater was still open, and I imagine that there were three reasons for this. One, the tickets and concessions were cheap. Two, they showed a different cult movie on Friday and Saturday twice a month at midnight. And three, they sold beer to underage kids during the midnight showings. I went for the first two. Yeah, right. The theater showed movies during the day, ones that had just left real theaters. And as near as I could tell, the dark showings accounted for the day showings accounted for the majority of the dirt theater's business. But in all the times that I had gone to see a matinee there, not once had a movie ever started on time. In fact, there had been a time when the movie had started 20 minutes late, and the projectionist actually sped up the film so that the schedule wouldn't be compromised. Despite all this, the midnight showings always started at exactly midnight. It was a strange business model, but one that must have worked because, as far as I know, the theater is still open for business. In my sophomore year of high school, when I was 15, Chris, Adam, Ryan, and I went to the Dirt Theater to see Scanners by David Cronenberg for $1. I have heard of that movie, by the way, Scanners. Yeah, it's a movie that if you watch David Cronenberg's stuff, you would know how crazy this kind of his movies would get. So yeah, that movie is bound to be crazy. We had arrived with enough time to secure virtually whatever seats we wanted, but we sat in the very back of the theater. I wanted to sit closer to the front for a good view, but since Ryan had driven us, the choice was his. Rather than a good view, we were left with virtually no view at all, but for some reason, Adam and I were the only ones who seemed bothered by this. There were no previews before the midnight feature, so much of the audience would slide in close to showtime. Just a few minutes before the movie started, a group of attractive girls walked into the steadily filling theater. Whatever conversation my friends and I were having stalled and quickly died away as we watched them make their way to the seats they had chosen. Chris and the other two in our party made unsavory comments, while I sat silently and watched the girls continue on their path. Each of the girls was attractive in her own way, but whatever beauty the other girls might have had, it was eclipsed by the girl with the dirty blonde hair. Even though I had only caught a glimpse of her profile, as she turned to move her seat, I caught a full view of her face, and it gave me the feeling of butterflies in my stomach. It was Veronica. I dropped my bookmark for 1 second. Yeah, I dropped my bookmark. Moving on. I hadn't seen her in a long time. Josh and I progressively Josh and I saw progressively less of one another after we snuck out to my old house that night when we were 10, and usually when I would visit him, she'd be out with friends. But here she was. Of all the places she could have been, she was sitting right in front of me at the worst movie theater in the city. I couldn't stop looking at her. While everyone stared at the screen, I stared at Veronica, only looking away when the feeling that I was being a creep overcame me, but that feeling would quickly subside and my eyes would return to her. She really was beautiful, just like I thought she'd be when I was a kid. When the credits started to roll, my friends got up and left the room. There was only one exit, and they didn't want to be trapped waiting for the crowd to clear. I lingered in hopes of catching Veronica's attention, though I had no idea what I should say. As she and her friends walked by, I took a chance. Hey, Veronica? She turned toward me, looking a little startled. Yeah? I got out of my seat and stepped a little into the light that was coming in through the open door. It's me, Josh's old friend from way back. How have you been? Her mind seemed to search for the right frame of reference, but until it finally clicked. Oh my god! Hey, it's been so long! She motioned to her friend that she'd be out in a second. Yeah, a few years at least. That's since the last time I stayed over with Josh. How's he doing anyway? Oh, that's right. I remember all you guys' games. Do you still play Ninja Turtles with your friends? She laughed a little, and I blushed. No, I'm not a kid anymore. Me and my friends play X-Men now. I was really hoping she'd laugh. She did. You're cute. Do you come to these movies every time? What did she say? Does she really think I'm cute? Did she just mean I'm funny? Does she think I'm attractive? I was still reeling from what she said when I suddenly realized that she had asked me a question. My mind grasped for what it was. Yeah, I said too much loudly. Yeah, I tried to anyway. What about you? I come every now and then. My boyfriend didn't like these movies, but we just broke up, so I'm planning on coming more often. I felt my heart flutter a bit, and I tried to be casual, but I failed. Oh, well, that's cool. Not that you guys broke up. I just meant that you'd be able to come more often. She laughed again. I like how this guy is making some pretty decent recoveries on this woman. I tried to recover. So, are you coming the week after next? They're supposed to show Day of the Dead. She looked a little hesitant, so I pressed further and pretended to be charming. I think we've gotten to know each other after pretty well in the last few minutes. I'm pretty positive you'd like the movie, especially if you went to the Saturday showing. She chuckled. Well, in that case, I'll be here. I wanted so badly to know if she was coming because I had asked her, or if she had already intended to attend. Intended to attend. I'm just saying that so you guys know what I'm saying. But I convinced myself that it didn't matter. She would be there either way. I was about to suggest that maybe we could sit together when she quickly closed the space between us and hugged me. It was really good to see you, she said with her arms around me. I was trying to think of what to say when I realized that my biggest problem was that I had forgotten how to talk. Luckily, Chris, who I could hear approaching from the hallway, came in and spoke for me while Veronica incapacitated me with her embrace. Dude, you know the movie's over, right? Let's get the fuck out of. Oh, baby! Veronica let go and said that she'd see me next time. She was played out of the room by the porn music Chris was making with his mouth. Oh God, not that freaking music. I'm instantly thinking of a particular piece of music and I'm not gonna play it because obvious reasons. But if you know, you know what I'm thinking of here. And I only know this because I hear it I've heard it so many times on YouTube. Because people like to do this one prank where, like, they could have this piece of music playing, but then instead, like, after that, they would have Stan Andreas' entrance music playing. You know, like their intro music playing on that. That's, yeah, it's kind of funny. Anyway, I was furious, but it dissipated as soon as I heard Veronica laughing in the lobby. On the ride home, Adrian, who the fuck is Adrian? It's Adam. What the On the ride home, Adam asked me how I knew the girl. I explained that he was my best friend's sister, and this caused an immediate uproar. Chris might have remembered Josh, but their reaction made me glad that I hadn't mentioned who my friend was, since that would have only served to intensify Chris's jibbing disapproval. I attempted to defend myself by saying that we weren't really good friends anymore, since we hardly ever spoke, but as soon as I said this, I felt terrible. There was a lull in the conversation. I think they understood that it had gone in a bad direction for me. Chris attempted to fix this by leaning over the center console of the car and making kissing sounds at Ryan. The tension broke and my feelings of guilt began to evaporate as my thoughts returned to Veronica. I spent the next week and a half in impatient anticipation for what I was planning on considering my first date, even though it probably wouldn't be a date at all. I thought about what I would say, whether I would try to sit next to her, and what might happen if we somehow wound up alone together, without our respective groups of friends. I even thought about what I would wear, which was not something I had ever really put much of consideration into. Day of the Dead couldn't come soon enough. Just a few days before the movie, however, the whole plan began to unravel. Ryan told me that he and his family were going out of town, so he wouldn't be able to drive us. Neither Chris nor Adam had cars, so as a last resort, I had asked my mom if she could take me. I felt nervous as I walked into the living room to ask her because she seemed to strongly prefer that I go out with a group of friends if I was going to go out at all. However, I think the real reason I was nervous was that this would leave me without any kind of buffer between Veronica and myself. No buffer except for the one offered by her friends. But that provided no comfort to me. Talking to one girl made me nervous enough. When I asked my mother, she responded by telling me that she would think about it. But I persisted, and she noticed the desperation in my voice. She asked why I wanted to go so badly, since I had seen the movie before, and I hesitated before saying that I was hoping to see a girl there. She smiled and asked playfully if she knew the girl. Remembering the reaction of my friends the night I had run into Veronica, I was tempted to lie, but I thought my mom might not think it was such a big deal. I reluctantly told her that it was Veronica. The smile disappeared from her face and she coldly said, "No." When I asked her what the problem was, she told me that I should keep nagging her if my goal was to stay home all weekend, so I backed down. Having reached an impasse, I decided that I would call Veronica to see if she could pick me up. If she said no, then at least my curiosity regarding whether she was only going to the theater because I asked her to would be satisfied. There was still the matter of her actually picking me up at my house and how my mom would react to that, but I'd worry about that problem when it actually was a problem. I had no idea Veronica. Hold on, let me do something real quick. Hold on a second. Alright. I had no idea Veronica still lived at home, but I figured it was still worth a try. When I picked up the phone and dialed the first number, I realized that Josh might answer. I hadn't talked to him in almost 3 years, and if he answered, I obviously couldn't ask to talk to his sister. I felt guilty for calling to speak with Veronica and not Josh, and I felt even worse because even up until that moment, my phone number had always been Josh's number, but I hadn't even thought of him as I started dialing. I tried to think of the last time that I had talked to Josh. For a moment, I thought that it was just a few months after my 12th birthday, but I realized I hadn't actually spoken with him then. I remembered that his parents had called and spoken with my mother. She told me that they were updating their address book and just wanted to confirm that we had the same number. I asked my mom if Josh had asked to speak with me, and my mom looked sad and said that he hadn't. As I clutched the phone and held my thumb over the buttons, resentment started to build in me as a way to suffocate the guilt that Josh hadn't called me in years either, even after he insisted that he would. There was no reason to feel bad about any of this. I dialed the rest of the number that was still embedded in my muscle memory from having dialed it so often when we were children. After a few rings, someone finally picked up, and when I heard the click of the connecting call, I felt my heart rate accelerate. It wasn't Josh. I felt a mixture of both relief and disappointment. I realized in that second that I really missed Josh. After this weekend, I would call him, but this was my only chance to see if Veronica could or would take me, so I asked for her. The person told me that I had dialed the wrong number. I asked who I was speaking with, and she told me her name was Claire. I repeated the number back to her, and she confirmed. Claire said they must have changed their number, and I agreed. I apologized for the disturbance and hung up, and as soon as the phone was back on the receiver, I became intensely sad because now I couldn't contact Josh even if I wanted to. I felt terrible for having been afraid that he might answer the phone. He had been my very best friend, and distance can wreak havoc on a friendship if you let it. And we had both been complicit in the atrophying of our relationship. I felt selfish for attempting to force the blame onto Josh just to justify my desire to see his sister. I realized that the only way I could be put back in touch with him would be through Veronica, so now, not that I needed one, I had another reason to see her. I told my mom the Friday before the movie that I was no longer concerned with going, but was hoping she could drop me off at Chris's house the next day. She had met Chris several times and was fond of him, and since she no longer had to contend with my request to go to the movies, she relented and dropped me off the following day, just a couple of hours before the movie. Chris didn't know about my plan until I arrived at his house that evening. After we ate dinner with his parents, we went back to his room, and I explained my intentions to him. Since Chris only lived about a half mile away from the theater, my plan was to walk there from his house. His family went to church early on Sundays, so his parents would go to sleep early that night. He had pretended to be offended that I was using them as a part of my scheme, but it was fairly clear that he didn't care. Why should he? I mean, at least he's helping a brother out. Let's put it that way. Initially, I was apprehensible about telling him that I didn't want him to come with me, but whether he was simply doing me a favor or was telling the truth, before I could even bring it up, he volunteered to stay behind since he had planned on chatting with the girl he met online. Chris reminded me that Veronica was a senior in high school and that I was guaranteed to make a fool of myself. He said that the walk back to his house would be even lonelier after she laughed in my face when I tried to kiss her. I told him not to electrocute himself when he tried to have sex with his computer. What the What? That's some literal sex sent me to the ER type of going on right there. Oh my god, bro. What the hell? Okay then. I left his house at 11:15 that night. I tried to pace myself so I'd get there just a little before the movie. I was going by myself, so I didn't want to just loiter impatiently outside of the building. On the way to the theater, I figured that if Veronica showed up at all, it would be too lucky for us to arrive at the same time. So I debated whether I should wait outside or just go in. If I went in first, then she might not notice me when she entered the dark theater, but the same was true for me if I waited for her and she was already inside. It also occurred to me that she would probably be with her friends again, and I needed to figure out how to insert myself into their group without being scoffed at for being too young. The grass on the side of the road where I walked was ankle high, and as my shoes moved against it, I could feel the occasional mist of water from that afternoon's rain curling up and colliding with my dangling hands. The sky had cleared itself of clouds in the evening, but the cool air still lingered, and this made the walks more pleasant, despite my insecurities and uncertainties. As I was grappling with the decision of whether to wait for Veronica or go into the theater once I got there, I noticed that the steady stream of streaking car lights that had been overtaking me had been replaced by a single constant spotlight that refused to pass. The road wasn't illuminated by streetlights, which was why I had been walking in the grass to begin with. I was already about 2 feet away from the road, but thought that it might not be far enough for a nervous motorist. I stepped a little more to my right and craned my neck over my left shoulder, ready to flag the person to pass, and I heard the squeaking of old brakes as I adjusted my posture. A car had stopped about 15 feet behind me. I stopped walking and turned around to face the car. All I could see were the violently bright headlights that were cutting through the otherwise Stygian surroundings. I thought that it might be one of Chris's parents. Maybe they had come to check in on us and say that I was gone. It wouldn't have taken much pressing for Chris to confess. In fact, he might have done it gladly since it would have been even more humorous to him if my big date had been intercepted by his mom. I took one step toward the car and it broke its pause and started driving toward me at a slow pace. As it passed me, I saw that it wasn't Chris's parents' car, or any car that I recognized for that matter. I tried to see the driver, but it was too hard to see inside the car at all since my pupils had shrunk when faced with the blinding headlights just moments before. They adjusted enough that I could see a tremendous crack in the back window of the car as it drove away. Asshole, I muttered. After a few more minutes of walking, I laughed a little now that the urgency of the situation had passed. I could see myself doing something like that to a pedestrian. Sometimes it could be fun to scare other people. I'd often hide around corners and jump out of my room at my mom after all. I timed the walk correctly and got there about 10 minutes before the movie started. There wasn't a line, so I approached the ticket seller and bought a pass for myself. He was overweight and sweating so profusely that beads of perspiration were sliding off the top of his hairless scalp and down the stringy ponytail he had fashioned with the hair that still grew on the back of his head. When he handed me my ticket, it was damp. After about a minute, I went back to the counter, slid another dollar bill through the slot, and bought a ticket for Veronica. As the employee handed me my half of the cheap raffle tickets they used as stubs, he snorted and said that I must really like this movie to see it twice in one weekend and buy extra tickets. I walked away even more surprised than the Dirt Theater was still in business, with him handling the cash and counting it. I had decided to wait outside until around 11:57, since that would give me time to find Veronica inside if she was already seated. As I was reconsidering the possibility that she might not show, I saw her. She was beautiful, and she was alone. I waved to her and walked to close the distance. She smiled and asked if my friends were already inside. I said that they weren't coming and realized that it must seem like I was trying to make this a date. I felt my palms start to sweat inside my pockets as I rubbed the already damp tickets between my fingers and debated whether or not I should just let her buy her own now. Despite the fact that I had come alone, she didn't seem bothered, nor was she bothered when I pressed my luck further and handed her the ticket I had already bought for her. When she looked at me quizzically, I said, "Don't worry, I'm rich." She laughed, and we went inside. I bought us one popcorn and two drinks and spent most of the movie debating whether or not I should time reaching my hand into the popcorn bag when she did so that our hands might touch. Having seen the movie already last year, I didn't pay much attention to it. Instead, I donated it to Veronica in the form of sidelong looks and occasional comments. For the past 2 weeks, I had played out cliche scenarios in my mind wherein she would get scared and cling to me. That didn't happen, but I thought that probably never really happened anyway. Aside from one unfortunate interruption where I had to run out of the theater and find somewhere that would hopefully sound like Chris's house to take a call from my mom, there was no awkward moments during the movie. Veronica seemed to enjoy the film, and before I knew it, it was over. We didn't linger in the theater, and because this was a midnight showing and the theater was closing, we couldn't loiter in the lobby, so we walked outside. The parking lot of the theater was big because it connected with a mall that had gone out of business years before. We stood and talked for a long time as the rest of the audience drove away from the theater. Not wanting the night to be over just yet, I continued the conversation while casually walking toward the old mall, away from where I thought Veronica had parked. Since she wasn't scared during the movie, I thought to tell her a story I had heard about this mall. As I began the tale, I looked back and saw that her car wasn't the only one left in the parking lot. The other one had a large crack in the back window. I stood and stared at it, puzzled and unnerved. "So there was a robbery?" Veronica said in an attempt to put me back on the story. "Right," I continued. I tried to put the car out of my mind as we resumed our walk and left the theater out of sight. "Well, kinda. So the mall closed like 5 years ago, but way back this was the place where everyone would come to hang out and shop. As opposed to all the other awesome places. Wait, hold on. As opposed to all the other awesome places in this town?" she interjected sarcastically. "Damn right! Anyway, everyone thinks that the place just went out of business. But that's not true. What happened was that at some point the manager, or whoever noticed that a lot of food in the inventory was, or whoever noticed that a lot of the food inventory was going missing. I don't mean like candy bars. I'm talking like whole freezers of food. So I put all these security cameras everywhere, to try to catch who was taking it. But the cameras never showed anything. They'd be on all night, pointed at the freezers. But in the morning, they'd open them up, and all the food would be gone, and there'd be this huge mess. Spooky, she jibbed. "Just hang on. So the owner guy hires these two security guards to stay overnight and keep an eye out. The first couple of nights are no problem, right? No food is missing, everything's cool. But then one night, the guard hears this huge crash coming from across the empty mall, and so he runs over to see what's going on. Then he hears these screams. The smile was disappearing from Veronica's face. It's his partner, but he can't tell where the screams are coming from exactly. On the video, it's just him running back and forth, and he's shouting something, but the cameras don't have sound, so no one knows what he's saying. How do you know all this then? Just a second. So eventually the guard runs up to one of the freezers, the one behind the Chinese food place. Well, he opens it up. He takes a look inside and backs away, and then just runs out of the mall. He didn't even lock the doors. The owners come back in the morning, finds his mall unlocked and no signs of the security guards. He checks the tapes and doesn't understand what happened, but he sees who left the doors unlocked. After he checks the freezer and sees the mess and the missing food, he calls the police and sends them after the guard who just ran out. They find him at his house, just locked in his room, shaking. They asked him what happened, but the guy won't talk. They ask him about the food, but the guy just keeps shaking. Finally, they take him into the station for more questioning. The police have a theory that these two guys were involved somehow, so they start really interrogating the guy, but he just won't talk. Where's your partner? They ask him. What happened to your partner? Where did he take the food? But the guy won't crack. Finally, they start threatening him with jail time, and he just breaks down. The guy says he saw his partner being pulled through the big drain in the floor of the freezer. The police are like, pulled? Pulled by what? And the guy just starts crying and screams, a monster! They do an investigation but never find the partner. But when they open the gate on the floor, the grate on the floor of the freezer, they saw the pipe was gone, and it was just this big hole. The investigation shuts them all down for months, and the owner goes bankrupt. What about the guy, the security guard? Veronica asked, her voice trembling a little. He winds up in the insane asylum down south. He draws these pictures of the monster in his free time, but they always look different. I started trying to guide us to one of the giant windows that stretched from the fountain to the roof of the mall. But here's the thing. They never found any monster. But they did find all kinds of boxes and big plastic wrappers in that hole under the freezer. And they found the missing guard's flashlight down there too. It was smashed to pieces. We were right in front of the window. But the creepiest part is that they just gave up. They just shut down the mall and locked it up forever. They say that if you're quiet and you look for long enough, you can still see the monster walking around the mall now, since no one's there to bother it. But what's weird is that everyone who's ever seen it tells a different story of what it looks like. Dog noises, don't mind it. I pressed my hands in C-shapes against the window and peered through the dirty glass. Veronica followed my lead. We waited silently for almost a minute, our breath falling against the window. Right as she was in the middle of saying that she didn't see anything, I kicked the window hard with my foot, and the whole pane vibrated. Veronica shrieked briefly and tore away from the window, grabbing my arm as she moved back. You jerk! She yelled with a smile growing on her lips. What? Didn't you see it? I started laughing. I'm sorry. She playfully shoved me. I had heard that story so many times from Chris, but the window kick was my idea. Veronica seemed to like horror movies, so I was hoping that she would appreciate the story, and I was happy that she took the joke well. As the laughter and false hostility abated, my mind returned to the car with the cracked window. Suddenly, uneasiness turned to understanding and amusement. That makes a lot of sense. The driver of the car works here and must have figured I was on my way to the movie, I thought. Injecting real horror into the life of a horror fan seemed like an obvious move. That was exactly what I had just done. Yes, because horror is such a good genre if you actually do the movies right. With things more relaxed, we continued walking around the mall and started talking about the movie we had just seen. I told her that I thought Day of the Dead was better than Dawn of the Dead, but she refused to agree. I told her about when I called her old number and about my dilemma about who would answer the phone. She didn't find it as funny as I did, but she took my phone and put her number on in it. She commented that it might be the worst cell phone she'd ever seen. Her evaluation wasn't rescinded when I told her I couldn't even receive pictures on it. At least it plays really good music, I said. She looked at me quizzically and handed my phone back to me. I shook the phone rhythmically, and some chip of plastic or a stray metal screw that had come loose inside the phone's case and began to rattle around inside the phone. I danced in a self-mocking fashion briefly, and then tried to call her so she'd have my number, but I had no service. I power cycled the phone and took advantage of the high connection I always had when it first turned on. The call went through, and I watched her cancel it. Hey! I was going to leave you a voicemail. I had an important message for you. She laughed. Oh, yeah? What was it? Well, maybe I don't remember anymore. Should have just let it go to voicemail. I messed up the settings on this thing. It never goes to voicemail. It just rings forever. Yeah, your phone really sucks, I said as I shook mine like a maraca. We both laughed. I watched as she saved my number. We walked on. She told me that she was graduating, but she hadn't done well in school for the past couple of years, so she wasn't sure if she'd ever even get into college. She said that she should have gone to the magnet program that I was in, since she might be in a better spot now if she had. I told her to attach a picture of herself to the college application, and they'd pay her to go there, just so they could look at her. She didn't laugh at that one, and I thought she might be offended. She might have thought I was implying that she couldn't get in based on her intelligence. I nervous, I nervously glanced at her, she was just smiling, and even in that poor light I could see that she was blushing. I wanted to hold her hand, but I didn't. As we walked down the final side of the mall back toward the theater, I asked her about Josh. I had asked about him when I saw her in the theater with her friends weeks before, but she had simply brushed it aside, and I let her because I would have talked to her about anything. This time when I asked, she told me that she didn't want to talk about it. I asked her if he was at least doing okay, and she just said, I don't know. I figured Josh must have taken a wrong turn somewhere and started getting into trouble. I felt bad. I felt guilty. As we approached the parking lot, I noticed that the car with the cracked back window was gone and that her car was now the only one in the parking lot. I had no idea how long it took to clean up that theater before it closed, but as consistently dirty as that place was, I wasn't surprised that the employees had already left. Veronica asked me if I needed her to drive me back to Chris's house, and even though I really didn't need her to, I wanted her to, so I lied and said that it was a long walk and that I'd appreciate it. I had finished my soda during the movie and all the walking was putting pressure on my bladder. I knew that I could wait until I was back at Chris's, but I had decided that I was going to try to kiss her when she dropped me off, and I didn't want this biological nagging to rush me out of the car. This would be my first kiss. I struggled, but I could think of no ruse to conceal what I needed to do. The theater had closed, so I only had one option. I told her that I was going to go behind the theater to piss, but that I'd be back in 2 shakes. It was obvious that I thought it was hilarious, but she seemed to laugh more at how funny I found it than how funny it clearly was. On the way toward the theater, I stopped and turned toward her. I told her that I had a weird question, and her interest piqued. I asked her if Josh had ever told me that some kid named Alex had done something nice for me. She paused to think for a moment, and she said that he had. She inquired as to why I had asked, but I said it was nothing. Josh really was a good friend. When I went to go behind the theater, I realized that there was a chain link fence extending off of and running parallel to the walls of the building. She could still see me where I was standing, and the fence seemed to stretch on endlessly, so I thought I'd just hop it, duck out of sight, and return as quickly as I could. It may have been too much of an effort, but I thought it polite. I climbed the fence and walked just a little ways until I was out of sight. I heard Veronica yell for me to not stand on any grates or the mall monster might get me. For a moment, the only sounds were the crickets in the grass behind me and the collision of liquid and cement. Before too long, however, these sounds were overpowered by a noise that I can still hear when it is quiet and there are no other noises to distract my ears. In the distance, I heard a faint but distinct screeching, which quickly subsided, only to be replaced with a cascade of thundering vibrations. I realized quickly enough what it was. It was a car. The growling of the engine got louder, and then I thought, no, not louder, closer. The rumblings intensified. It was growing louder still. I started back toward the fence with haste, but before I could get very far at all, I heard a brief truncated scream, and the roar of the engine terminated in a deafening thud. I started running, but after only 2 or 3 steps, I was tripped by a loose piece of stone, and I fell hard and fast onto the concrete. My head striking the concrete of a bench as I fell. I was dazed for maybe 30 seconds, but the renewed rumbling of the engine drew my senses back, and my equilibrium was restored by my adrenaline. I redoubled my efforts. I was worried that whoever had crashed the car might harass Veronica. Briefly but forcefully, it occurred to me that we would have to call the police. My mom would be contacted because I was a minor. That wasn't how I wanted this night to end. As I was climbing over the fence, I saw that there was still only her car in the parking lot. I didn't see any evidence of a crash. I thought that I might have misjudged its direction or proximity, but I swore I could smell the faint and fleeting aroma of burned rubber or possibly machine smoke, and this was corroborated by a metallic taste that clung to my tongue. Each of my senses was telling me that something had happened, but my eyes defiantly returned ordinary images. As I ran toward Veronica's yellow car, I had to change my orientation to move around it. Finally and terribly, my eyes joined my other alerted senses. I saw what the car had hit, and my legs stopped working almost completely. It was Veronica. Her car was sitting between us, and as I closed the distance and walked around it, she came fully into view. Veronica's body lay twisted and crumpled on the black asphalt of the parking lot, her limbs so unnaturally contorted that she looked like a child's discarded wooden art doll that now showcased a catalog of things the human body cannot do. As I looked at her, I actually found it hard to discern whether she was lying on her back or on her stomach, and my vision warped the space around her in an attempt to see a human figure again. This optical illusion made me feel sick with dizziness to the point that I had to close my eyes for a moment for fear of vomiting. Veronica? I pleaded with limp, vibration-less vocal cords. The sound nothing more than the broken whisper of a ghost. The bone of her right shin had cut savagely through her jeans and stood erect atop a fountain of blood-stained denim. Her other leg bent out to the side twice, as if she had a second joint in her femur. I traced her figure and saw that her left arm had been dislocated at the shoulder and was wrapped so hard and forcefully around the back of her neck that her hand fell over her right breast with her fingertips nearly touching her navel. I stepped a little. Man, what is with this? Jesus. Yeah, when I said this man was pretty much like the modern day Stephen King, I did not even read this part of the book. Yeah, he is very much like Stephen King because he is being very descriptive in his wording. So violent that it's reminding me of 2 books in particular: Misery and The Green Mile. You'll know why when we get to those books. I stepped a little closer and knelt down, gravity doing the lion's share of the work as my legs trembled. Her head was craned back and her mouth hung widely open toward the sky, and as I looked into her half-hidden eyes, They stared absolutely back into mine, as lifeless and cold as a shark's. Blood was pooling around my shoe now. There was so much of it. Just wanted to check something there, sorry. When you are confronted with something in the world that simply doesn't belong, your mind tries to convince itself that it is dreaming, and to that end it provides you with that distinct sense of all things moving slowly, as if through sap. In that moment, I honestly felt that I would wake up any minute. But I didn't wake up. I fumbled with my phone to call for help, but I had no signal. I was depressing the power button in the hopes that the signal would return when the phone was turned back on. When I saw Veronica's phone sticking out of what I thought was her front right pocket, I had no choice. Trembling, I reached for her phone and took a hold of it. As I slid it out, she moved and gasped so violently for air that it seemed as if she was trying to breathe in the whole world. This startled me so much that I staggered back and fell onto the asphalt with her phone in my hand. She was trying to adjust her body to get it into its natural position, but with every spasm and jerk of her body, I could hear the crackling and grinding of her bones. Without thinking, I scrambled over to her and put my face over hers and pleaded, "Veronica, don't move. Don't move, okay? Just stay still. Don't move. Veronica, please, just don't move." I kept saying it, but the words started to fall apart as tears came streaming down my face. I opened her phone. It still worked. It was still on the screen where she had saved my number, and when I saw that, I felt my heart break a little. I called 911 and waited with her, telling her that she would be okay, and feeling guilty for lying to her every time I said it. When the sound of sirens tore through the air, she seemed to become more alert. She had remained conscious since first coming to, but now more of the light was coming back into her eyes. She was breathing steadily, but it was a gurgling, labored breathing. Her brain was still protecting her from pain, though it looked as if it was finally allowing her to become aware that something was terribly wrong with her. Her eyes rolled over to mine, and her lips moved. She was struggling, but I heard her. Pic- Picture. My picture. He took it. I didn't understand what she meant, so I said the only thing I could. "I'm so sorry, Veronica." Hmm. I'm actually gonna go ahead real quick and use the restroom. I'll be right back with the rest of that story. Give me 1 second. And my foot's asleep from sitting on my chair like that. Alright. Okay. Oh, jeez, I'm like right there next to the camera. Jeez, man. Gotta love old chairs when they love to stick on your clothes in some way. Like they like to get caught on it. Alright. Going back to the book. Right now. I rode with her in the ambulance where she finally and mercifully lost consciousness. The paramedics asked me several times what happened, but I could only mutter the word car. I was staring so vacantly that one of the paramedics shined a light to my eyes in an attempt to determine if I had been injured as well. When he returned his attention to Veronica, I felt guilty that he had even had to waste his time on me. When we arrived at the hospital, the nurses wheeled Veronica through a set of double doors. As the paramedics rushed by me, one of them put Veronica's purse in my lap. I fidgeted with the leather strap and sat anxiously yet absently in the waiting room. The blank stare had returned to my eyes as my mind swam in every direction, with no guidance or trajectory. The shouts, coughs, cries, and talking of the emergency room waiting area became a dull buzzing in my ear as I went completely numb to all things. All things but one. Hey Turkey, how you doing tonight? I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for asking. Almost done with this chapter and then going into the so yeah, I'm going into this chapter, chapter 5, or section 5, whatever you want to call it. Going soon to chapter 6, and then when we get done with this book, I'll do a quick review of it, what I thought of it, and revealing the next book that I'll be reading after this. A phone was vibrating in my pocket. My pulse quickened and my throat dried as I reached my hand into my pants pocket to fish out the phone. My mother was trying to check in on me again. I had no idea how I was going to explain this to her. I wasn't worried about getting in trouble. Those consequences seemed so remote and insignificant to everything now. But what combination of words could I possibly cobble together to explain all this? Between vibrations, I tossed my hand around my phone and pulled it out. It was off. For just a moment, I thought the call had simply stopped, or perhaps my phone had died just then somehow. But this moment of confusion ended as soon as the vibrations began again. Still in my pocket. I still had Veronica's phone and someone was calling it. I felt my eyes begin to wander and I reached into my pocket to retrieve Veronica's phone. I looked at the screen and could see that her dad was calling her. I needed to answer it. I needed to tell him what had happened. Veronica's mom was a nurse. Maybe she could help. I needed to let someone know what was going on. But every time I tried to imagine even a fragment of what I might say, my thoughts would splinter into pieces too small to reassemble. I kept hoping the phone would just stop ringing, that the insistence that I answer would be over. But I knew from what Veronica had told me earlier that as long as her dad kept his phone to his ear, her phone would never stop ringing. With a burning in my chest, I moved my thumb over to the phone and pressed ignore. Relief, guilt, and shame boiled within me, and I collapsed my head onto my knees and cried. Collecting myself, I went to the counter to see if there was any information on Veronica's condition, but not enough time had passed for there to be any news that would be good news. Before leaving the counter, I asked if I could make a call. I dialed my mom's number into the hospital phone. Looking at the clock on the wall, I saw that it was about 4 a.m., and I held my breath as the line sought a connection. She answered. I told her that I was fine, that Veronica was not. She cursed at me and said she'd be right there, but I told her I wasn't leaving until Veronica was out of surgery. She said she'd come anyway. The police entered the hospital just a little after I hung up the phone with my mother. They didn't have many questions for me, and the ones that they did have were met with very helpful answers. I hadn't seen the driver. I didn't get the license plate. I could only tell them that I thought that it was a brown car, but I couldn't even tell how many doors were on it. As the police officers were walking away, I yelled at them, and they walked back over to where I was sitting. I told them that the car I was talking about had a big crack in the back window. Sensing how important I was feeling, one of the officers said that would be a big help. Don't worry, we'll find him. My mom and I didn't speak that much when she got to the hospital. After verifying that I was unharmed, her relief transitioned into anger. I told her I was sorry for lying, and she said that we'd talk about it later. For the majority of the time that we sat together in the waiting room, there was silence between us. There didn't seem to be anything to say. I think that had we talked more in that room, if I just told her about boxes or the night with the raft, if she had just told me more of what she knew, I think that things would have changed. but I didn't know that any of those things mattered. They were just distant memories of strange adventures to me. So I sat there in silence and she looked at me while I looked at the floor. She told me that she loved me and that I could call her whenever I wanted to. I wanted her to come get me. As my mom was leaving, Veronica's parents rushed in with the wide eyes of people who are attempting to see what is important in a room as quickly as possible. My mom must have called them after I had spoken with her. Veronica's dad and my mom exchanged a few words that appeared to be quite serious, while Veronica's mother talked to the person at the desk. Her mother was a nurse but didn't work at this hospital. I'm sure that she had tried to get Veronica transferred, but her condition was prohibitive. While all of these conversations were taking place, I slipped Veronica's phone back in her purse to hide the evidence of the conversation that I was too much of a coward to have. The police talked to each of us, including me, for a second time. I told them what happened again. They made some more notes, and then they left. Veronica came out of surgery several hours later with a thick white cast covering 90% of her body. Her right arm was free, but the rest of her was cocooned in plaster. Her parents and I walked to Veronica's room. They never asked me for her purse, so I just set it on the table to the right of her bed. She was still under the anesthetic, but I remembered how I felt when I had my cast before kindergarten. I asked the nurse for a marker, but I couldn't think of anything to write. I slept in a chair in the corner and went home the next day. I came back every afternoon for several days. At some point, they had moved another patient into her room and set up a screen around both beds to act as a partition. The divider was always closed, so I could never tell if the person in the adjacent bed was sleeping. However, I once caught a glimpse and saw that in addition to the cast on his left wrist, the occupant's face was completely covered in bandages, so I decided to always speak in hushed tones just in case. Veronica didn't seem to be feeling better, but she had more moments of lucidity. But even during these periods, we wouldn't really talk. Her jaw had been broken by the car, so the doctors had it wired shut. I sat with her for a while, but there was nothing much I could say. I got up, walked over to her, and kissed her on the forehead. As I turned, as I turned to leave the room, she whispered through her clenched teeth, "Josh." This surprised me a little, but I looked at her and said, "Has he not come to see you?" "No." I grew infuriated. Even if Josh had gone down the wrong path at some point, he should still have come see his sister, I thought. I was about to express this when she said, "No, Josh, he ran away. I should have told you." I felt my blood turn to ice. When? When did this happen? 2 years ago, a little after his 13th birthday. How? Why do you think he ran away? The note on his pillow. She started crying, and I followed her, but I think now we were crying for different reasons. Even if I didn't fully realize it, there was still so much that I didn't remember, so many connections I hadn't yet made. But I remembered the letter, even if I didn't know what it had truly meant. I told her that I had to go, but that she could text me any time. I pulled the phone out and set it on the table right next to her free hand. I asked her if she was going to be okay alone, and she told me that her mom was coming in a little later that day, so she would be fine. I got a text message from her the next day, and I hesitated before opening it. When I read it, I wished that I had hesitated just a little bit longer. It said, "Please don't come back. Please don't come back here." It took me almost a full minute to type a simple "Why not?" in reply, because my flustered brain kept directing my fingers to the wrong keys. She said she didn't want me to see her like that again, and I agreed begrudgingly because it was only a temporary quarantine. We texted each other every day, though I kept this from my mom because I knew that she didn't like me talking to Veronica. The events of the night at the Dirt Theater had caused an intense strain in the dynamic between my mother and me, and our interactions became abruptly cold and infrequent after I asked her why she hadn't told me that Josh had run away. She claimed she simply did not know, that she didn't talk to his parents anymore. In a way, I thought this made sense. If I had fallen out of touch with Josh, my best friend, then why should I expect our respective parents to stay in close contact? But the fact that she had called them before coming to the hospital meant that she had their new number, which was something that I was never privy to, and this bothered me. Veronica's texts were generally fairly short and mostly only in response to more lengthy texts that I would send her. I tried calling her only once. I was sure she was screening her calls, but hoped that I could at least hear her voice. She picked up but didn't say anything. I could hear how labored her breathing was. I thought I might have heard her say my name, but it was hard to tell. Eventually, I just had to hang up to stop myself from crying again. About a week after she told me not to come see her anymore, she sent me a text that simply read, "I love you." I was filled with so many different emotions. Not one from outside my no one from outside my family had ever said that to me before. Hold on, this thing is. Jeez, I need to sit up because you guys can barely see me down in that other position. No one from outside my family had ever said that to me before, and somehow reading those words, which came not as a compulsory and reflexive expression that ends phone calls between family members, but from someone who really felt it, showed me why those words were so powerful. There were so many words that I wanted to say, but only a few that I felt I needed to say. I love you too. Over the next several weeks, the intensity grew. Veronica said that she wanted to be with me and that she couldn't wait until she could see me again. She told me that she had been released from the hospital and was convalescing at her house, but every time I asked to come see her, she would always say, "Soon." In the back of my mind, a nagging guilt tore at my jubilation. I realized that her feelings for me were most likely artificial symptoms of her injuries. Maybe she only felt close to me because she had almost been taken away from everything. Each time I received a message from her, however, these concerns evaporated in the heat of my happiness, and I would insist again that she let me see her. Finally, the following week, she said that she thought she might be able to make it to the next midnight movie. I couldn't believe it. I suggested that we meet somewhere that would be a little less strenuous, but she insisted that she would try. She said that she wanted to redo our date, and I admitted her strength and optimism for that. And I admired her strength and optimism for that. I got a text from her the afternoon of the movie saying, "See you tonight." Chris's parents had found out about everything that had happened and said I wasn't welcome at their house anymore, so I got Ryan to drive me. Winter is coming and I'm already got cold. Oh, yeah, colds are not really fun. The flu and the cold are not really fun. They can come and go as quickly or as they come and go however often they come and go. But when you get them, it sucks having them. It's terrible. Yeah, I don't like it. My mother tried to stop me, but I was bigger than her now, so I simply walked out of the house and got into Ryan's car. I explained to him that Veronica might be in bad shape, but that I really cared about her, so he should give us some space. He accepted that, and we headed to the theater. Veronica didn't show. I had saved a seat for her right next to me near the exit so she could get in and out easily, but 15 minutes into Akira, I know of the. Before I continue with that sentence. I absolutely have. I have seen that movie. I haven't seen it all the way. I stopped watching it at a certain point, like right near the end of it, and it wasn't because I wasn't really interested in it. It was because I was doing this thing at the time where I would watch the TV shows and movies. I would watch the TV shows for the amount of time that they had, but I would watch the movies for around half an hour. So I was like at the last half hour mark of Akira when I stopped watching the movie. I need to watch the rest of it. But I do know they got it on Blu-ray, so I might get it on Blu-ray. They got so many good anime movies on Blu-ray that I might start getting some of them. But anyway, but anyway, I'm going to repeat the sentence so that way we're all good here. I had saved a seat for her right next to me near the exit so she could get in and out easily. But 15 minutes into Akira, a man slid into the chair. I whispered, "Excuse me, the seat is taken." But he didn't respond at all. He just stared ahead at the screen. I remember wanting to move because there was something wrong with the way he was breathing, but I forfeited after a while because I realized that Veronica wasn't coming, so it really didn't matter where I sat or who sat next to me. I texted her the next day and asked if she was alright. I inquired as to why she didn't show the previous night, but she didn't respond. Despite my attempts to restrain myself and be patient, I messaged her repeatedly, pleading with her to at least tell me how she was feeling. She responded with what would turn out to be the last message I would ever receive from her. She simply said, see you again, soon." She was delirious, and I was worried about her. I sent her several replies, reminding her about the movie and saying it was no big deal, but she just stopped replying. I grew increasingly upset over the next several days. I couldn't reach her at her home because I didn't know the number, and I wasn't even sure where they lived. However, I knew that my mom knew at least one of these things. With no other options, I turned to my mother. I told her that I knew that she must know Veronica's parents' phone number, since I suspected that she had called them the night of the accident. I told her that all I needed was that number. She asked me why, and when I told her that I hadn't heard from Veronica in days, I felt all of what little warmth that was left in her disposition dissipate. What do you mean? I don't want to get into an argument with you over this, but she was supposed to meet me at the movies yesterday. I knew there hadn't been much time since she got hit, but she said she would try to come, and after that she just stopped talking to me altogether. She must hate me. If we wouldn't have gone to that movie, then she would still be okay right now. I don't know what to do now. I just want to tell her that I'm sorry. That I'm sorry for everything. She looked confused, and I could read on her face that she was trying to tell me my mind had simply broken. There was an intense compassion in her eyes that lingered for as long as she thought that my whole unreality had slipped. When she saw that it hadn't, this compassion dissolved into defeated tears, and she pulled me toward her to embrace me. She was beginning to sob, but it seemed too intense for a reaction to my problem, and I had no reason to think that she particularly cared for Veronica. Quite the opposite seemed true. She drew in a shuddering breath and then said something that still makes me nauseous even now. Veronica's dead. Veronica's dead, sweetheart. Oh God, I thought you knew. I pulled away aggressively. What? What are you talking about? She said she was doing better. She said she was feeling better, Mom. There was a long pause. What happened to Veronica? What happened to Veronica? She's dead, sweetie. She died on the last day you visited her. Oh, honey, she died weeks ago. She had completely broken down, but I knew it wasn't because of Veronica. I staggered backwards. This wasn't possible. I had just exchanged messages with her yesterday. I could only think to ask one question, and it was probably the most trivial one I could ask. Then why was her phone still on? She continued sobbing. She didn't answer. I exploded. Why did it take them so long to shut off her goddamn phone? Her climb broke enough to mutter, "The pictures." My mother told me that Veronica's parents had thought that her phone had been lost in the accident, despite the fact that I had put it in her purse the night she brought it to the hospital. When they retrieved her belongings, the phone was not among them, but they didn't deactivate the line. I asked my mom why this was, why they had failed to close her account, but she said she didn't know. But I think I know. I think they just couldn't bear to do even one more thing that forced them to admit that she was gone. It probably would have kept that line active forever, but they received a call from their service provider informing them of a massive impending charge for hundreds of pictures that had been sent from her phone. Pictures. Pictures that were all sent to my phone. Pictures that I never got because my phone couldn't receive them. They learned that they were all sent from the night Veronica died. They deactivated the phone immediately. I tried not to think about the contents of those pictures, but I remember wondering for some reason that I couldn't place whether I would have been in any of them. My mouth went dry and I felt the painful sting of despair as I thought of the last message I received from her phone. See you again. Soon. It's time for the final chapter. We are about an hour and 20 minutes into this, but we can finish this book. Maybe within 2 hours, maybe not, let's see. Final section / chapter 6. Friends. On the first day of kindergarten, my mom had elected to drive me to school. We were both nervous and she wanted to be there with me all the way up to the moment I walked into class. It took me a bit longer to get ready in the morning, due to my still mending arm. The test came up with a couple inches past my elbow, which meant that I had to cover the entire arm with a specially designed latex bag when I showered. The bag was built to pull tight around the opening in order to seal out any water that might otherwise destroy the cast. Since I still had to use my dominant hand, I had gotten really adept at cinching the bag myself. That morning, however, perhaps due to my excitement or nervousness, I hadn't pulled the strap tight enough, and halfway through the shower, I could feel water pooling inside the bag around my fingers. I jumped out and tore the latex shield away, but could feel that the previously rigid plaster had become soft after absorbing the water. Because there's no way to effectively clean. I need to quit moving down here, I'm telling you, man. Because there was no way to effectively clean the area between your body and a cast, the dead skin that would normally have fallen away merely sits there. When stirred by moisture like sweat, it emits an odor, and apparently this odor is proportionate to the amount of moisture introduced, because soon after I began to attempting to dry it, I was struck by the powerful stench of rot. As I continued to rub it frantically with the towel, the cast began to disintegrate into the thick white straps that rained down upon my feet, while small white flakes wafted into the air. It seemed to hover like snowflakes. I was growing increasingly distressed. I had put as much effort as a child could into his very first day of school. I had sat with my mom picking out my clothes. The night before, I had spent a great deal of time picking out my backpack, and I had become exceedingly excited to show everyone my lunchbox that had the Ninja Turtles on it. I had fallen into my mom's habit of calling these children. I hadn't yet met my friends already, but as the condition of my cast worsened, I became deeply upset at the thought that surely I wouldn't be able to apply that label to anyone by the time this day was over. When I realized that attempting to wipe the class dry was actually destroying it, I wrapped the towel around my arm and pressed it hard against my chest while leaning forcefully against the counter, in an effort to soak up the water without agitating the surface of the cast. But the wet plaster began to collapse under my weight, and the force transferred down to my weak and cracked bones. Pain anchored, pain arced across my arm, and I half successfully stifled a scream. I couldn't fix it myself. Defeated, I showed my mom. It took it took 30 minutes to get most of the moisture out while working to preserve the rest of the cast. The combination of placing restrained pressure on an absorbed cloth while running a hairdryer over the length of the cast was enough to solve the hydration issue. To address the problem of the smell, my mom cut slivers off a bar of soap and slid them down into the cast. She then rubbed the remainder of the soap onto the outside in an attempt to cocoon the rancid smell inside of a more pleasant one. There was no repair work that could be done, but she had at least controlled the damage. By the time we arrived at the school, my classmates were already engaged in their second activity, and the teachers shoehorned me into one of the already established groups. I'm sure that the teacher explained to me in great detail what the guidelines of the activity were, but I was so nervous and distracted that I must have misunderstood. Within about 5 minutes, I had violated the rules so badly that each member of the group complained to the teacher and asked why I had to be in their group. The teacher tried to make peace, but the damage was done. I sat at the table with my free hand in my pocket. I had brought a marker to school in hopes that I could collect some signatures or drawings on my cast next to my mother's, and as I rolled the marker between my fingertips, I suddenly felt very foolish for having even put it in my pocket that morning. After the exercise was over, we watched as our teacher brought a large rolled up piece of paper out of the classroom closet. While it was generally difficult to maintain the attention of so many children, the size of the object held our interest. We watched as she tacked the top and bottom left-hand corners of the paper to the wall as she talked to us. When the corners were secure, she unrolled the large cylinder of paper from left to right, and we saw what it was. It was a map. The teacher had us line up to leave the classroom for lunch. When we filed into the lunchroom, the faculty members from each group guided us to our cluster of tables and corrected students who tried to sit at restricted yet unoccupied seats. There were no other statements in there. There were no other students in there. Statements? What? There were no other students in there. The kindergartners had the lunchroom to themselves at my elementary school, and this meant that I wouldn't have to sit by myself. In a year's time, I would be all alone at the table about 8 feet away, but despite the fact that I was surrounded by classmates, I think I felt lonelier right then than in all the initial weeks of first grade isolation combined. One of the faculty members was making an announcement that no one seemed to be listening to, while most of the kids were chatting energetically. I was eavesdropping on their conversations while self-consciously picking at the frayed ends of my cast when a kid sat across from me. "I like your lunchbox," he said. I could tell he was making fun of me, and I grew really angry. In my mind, that lunchbox was the last good thing about my day. I had used it every day at home since my mom had gotten it for me. She would make me sandwiches and put them in my lunchbox, and I would carry it to the white dining room table and eat them. It wasn't for practice. I was just excited to see it. Lunch that day in school was the first time I had used my lunchbox out of the house, and despite everything that had happened with my cast and the group earlier that day, I was still excited to use it officially. I didn't look up from my arm to face my classmate because I felt a burning in my eyes from the tears that I was holding back. As I struggled to maintain my composure, I looked up to tell the kid to leave me alone. But before I could get the words out, I saw something that made me pause. He had the exact same lunchbox. I laughed. I like your lunchbox too. I think Michelangelo's the coolest, he said while miming nunchuck moves. This was the first conversation I had ever had with another kid my own age that wasn't guided or chaperoned by my mother. While I had a lot of freedom in my neighborhood, there weren't any other kids that were my age, so when I played alone. Even though this new dynamic made me slightly nervous, it was a good kind of nervous. I was speaking up to rebuke his preference by saying that Raphael was my favorite, when he knocked his open carton of milk off the table and onto his lap. Ah, crap, he said, and immediately covered his mouth with both hands and reflexively shifted his eyes from side to side to see who might have heard it. You know, the funny part is I did that one time myself. I was in second grade, and we were just in my class, and was coming back inside the building from outside, and I just instantly, I thought something, I forget what it was that I was thinking, but at the time I said, ah, crap, and then and literally everybody turned and looked at me, and I'm like, what did I just say? Because back in the day, to us, saying the word crap was basically like the adult version of saying the word shit. Okay? It's kind of it's kind of funny when you think about it. I tried very hard to stifle my laughter, since I didn't know him at all, but the struggling look on my face must have struck him as funny, because he started laughing first. Suddenly, I didn't feel so bad about my cast and thought that this person would hardly notice now anyway. As we laughed with one another, I thought to try my luck. Hey, do you want to sign my cast? As I worked the marker out of my pocket, he asked me how I broke my arm. I told him that I fell out of the tallest tree in my neighborhood, and he seemed impressed. I watched him laboriously draw his name on my cast, pausing before each letter to draw it in the air to make sure that it felt right. When he was done, I asked him what it said. He told me it said, Josh. Josh and I had lunch together every day, and whenever we could, we partnered up for projects. We became really close very quickly, to the point that if Josh was ever absent from school, I would feel a bit lost the entire day. We worked well together both within and outside of the curriculum of our grade. I helped him with his handwriting when I could, his spelling, and he took the blame when I wrote "fart" on the wall in permanent marker. I would come to know other kids, but I think I knew even then that Josh was my only real friend. Moving a friendship outside of school when you are 5 years old is actually more difficult than most remember. The, fri- the Friday we launched our balloons, the atmosphere was so energetic and excited that when I had finished transcribing my letter, I joined Josh at his desk and asked him if he wanted to come to my house after school to play and maybe even stay the night. He said he did and that he'd bring some of his toys. I said that we could also go exploring in the woods around my house. When I got home, I asked my mom if Josh could come to our house, and she said that would be fine. My enthusiasm was boundless until I realized that I had no way of contacting Josh to tell him. I spent the whole weekend worrying that our friendship would be dissolved by Monday. When I saw him after the weekend, I was relieved to find that he had run into the same obstacle and thought it was funny. Later that week, we both remembered to write down our phone numbers at home and then exchanged them at school. My mom spoke with Josh's dad, and it was decided that she would pick up Josh and me from school that Friday. We alternated this basic structure nearly every weekend. If we managed to make plans far enough in advance, we would even secure permission slips from our parents so that we could just get off the bus with each other at either his or my house. The fact that we lived so close to one another made the arrangements much easier for our parents, who seemed to work constantly. As time moved along, I found it more difficult to imagine doing things without Josh. That's not to say I actively tried to imagine such things, but as an only child I had never had the disposition to picture myself with anyone else, except maybe my mother. As Josh and I grew closer, however, whenever I thought of a new place to go or a new activity to try, I always reflexively inserted Josh into the scenario. We had so many adventures when I lived in my old house that I find it difficult to remember them all. The actual nature of what we were doing never really seemed to have any impact on how funny the activity was for us. As long as we were together, we had a good time. When my mom and I moved across the city during the summer after first grade, I was sure that our friendship had seen its last day. As we drove away from the house that I had lived in my whole life, I felt a sadness that I knew wasn't just about a house. I was saying goodbye to my friend forever. But to my surprise and delight, Josh and I stayed close. Despite the fact that we spent the majority of our time apart and only saw one another on the weekends, we remained remarkably similar as we grew. Our personalities coalesced, our senses of humor complemented each other's, and we would often find that we had started liking new things independently. I would sometimes call Josh, or he would call me, to share information about some new TV show or toy, only to find that it was old news from the other. We even sounded enough alike that when I stayed with Josh, he would sometimes call my mom pretending to be me. His success rate was impressive. My mom would sometimes joke that the only way she could tell us apart sometimes was by our hair. He had straight, dirty blonde hair like his sister, while I had curly, dark brown hair like my mother. One would think that the thing more likely to drive two young friends apart would be what's out of their control. I'm quite sure that many friendships have stagnated when one party is forced to move away. The parents thinking that their children will just make new friends. While I feared at the time that this would be the case for us, I think the catalyst of our gradual disengagement was my insistence that we sneak out to my old house to look for boxes. That night, perhaps because we were old enough to reflect on it appropriately, seemed to cause a rift between us. Not a striking and violent rift, but a gradual one, like two continents parting ways. The weekend after our excursion, I invited Josh over to my house, in keeping with our tradition of alternating houses, but he said that he wasn't really feeling up to it. If I'm honest, neither was I, and so I didn't protest, but maybe I should have. We began seeing progressively less of one another over the next year or so. Our time together had gone from once a week to once a month to once every couple of months. Unlike when we were kids, we seemed to struggle to find things to do or talk about, but it was all gradual enough that perhaps we didn't notice it, even if we might have felt it. For my 12th birthday, my mom threw a party for me. I hadn't made that many friends since we'd moved, so it wasn't a surprise party since my mom didn't know who to invite. I told a handful of kids with whom I had become acquainted, but I was fine with a smaller party. I didn't want to invite a person just because I recognized him in the hallway. About a week before the party, I called Josh to see if he wanted to come. He said that he didn't think he could make it. My mom had planned a lot of games and activities. There would be a piñata, pin the tail on the donkey, and she even convinced a coworker to come perform a part of his amateur magic show. It occurred to me as we sat on the phone in silence that Josh might think he was too old for these activities, and I tried to reassure him that he didn't have to play any of the games or watch the magician, but he said that he just didn't feel up to a party. He said, maybe some other time, and we hung up. After the phone call, I told my mom that I didn't want to have a party. I told her that I was too old for those games and that magicians were for kids. I told her that the whole thing was a dumb idea that she never should have had. The conversation with Josh had hurt me tremendously and senselessly, that the only thing that I could think to do was to try to hurt her. It didn't work, and she just smiled and put her arm on my shoulder and said, "It'll be fine, sweetheart." And inexplicably, I felt better. The day before the party, Josh called me in better spirits to say that he would be there. It had been it had been several months since I'd seen him, and I was excited that we would get to spend time together and not have to worry about what to do or what to talk about, since there would be activities. I wasn't sure why he had changed his mind, but it didn't really matter to me. He was coming. One moment, please. Alright, sorry about that. Moving on with this story. Where was I? Ah, yes, right here at the very bottom of the page. The party went pretty well. My biggest concern with. Hold on a second. I need to fix my glasses. Give me a second here. I'm going to mark my page. So that way I don't lose track of it, but I know where I'm at in the page. Anyway. Uh, Alright. Okay, that's not as good, but it's certainly better than what I thought it was. Alright. Alright. The party went pretty well. My biggest concern was that Josh and the other kids wouldn't get along, but they seemed to like each other well enough. Josh was quieter than I'd hoped he'd be. He hadn't brought me a gift, and he apologized for that, but I told him that it wasn't a big deal. I was just glad that he was able to make it. I tried to start several conversations with him, but they seemed to keep reaching dead ends. I didn't know what else to do. I had acclimated to the timid disposition that he had developed over the last couple of years, but I had hoped that things might be different that day. I asked him what was wrong. I told him that I didn't get why things had become so awkward between us. They were never like that before. We used to hang out almost every weekend and talk on the phone every couple of days. I suspect that it all really was about because of the night we snuck back to my old house. And even though I couldn't know for certain, my voice trembled in quaint as I told him that Boxes was my cat, and that it wasn't fair for him to hold that night against me for so long. But he didn't say anything. And as at a loss, I asked him what happened to us. He looked up from staring at his shoes and just said, "You left." I was about to ask Josh what he meant by that when my mom yelled in from the other room that it was time to open presents. I forced a smile and walked into the dining room as they sang "Happy Birthday." There was a couple of wrapped boxes in a pile of cards, most of which were from my extended family since they lived out of state. Most of the gifts were silly and forgettable, but I remember that a kid named Brian gave me a Mighty Max toy shaped like a snake that I kept for years afterwards. My mom was insistent that I open all the cards and thank each person who had given one, because several years before, on Christmas, I had torn through the wrapping paper and envelopes with such fervor that I destroyed any possibility of discerning who had sent which gift or what amount of money. Jeez. We separated the ones that had been sent by mail and the ones that had been brought that day so that my friends wouldn't have to sit through me opening cards from people that they had never met. Most of the cards from my friends had a few dollars in them. Hmm. One envelope didn't have my name written on it, but it was in the pile, so I opened it. The card had some birthday balloons on its face and seemed to be a card that had been received by someone else who was now recycling it for my birthday because it was a little dingy. I actually appreciated the idea that it was a reused card since I'd always thought that cards were silly. I angled it so that when the money wouldn't fall to the floor when I opened it, but the only thing inside was the message that had come printed in the card. I love you. Whoever had given me this card hadn't written anything in it, but they had circled the message in pencil a couple of times. I chuckled a little and said, "Gee, thanks for the awesome card, Mom." She looked at me inquisitively and then turned her attention to the card. She told me it wasn't from her and seemed to amuse that she took the card from my hand and showed my friends, looking at their faces, trying to discern who had played the joke. None of the kids stepped forward, so my mom said, Don't worry, sweetheart. At least you know now that two people love you." Ha ha, very funny, Mama. She followed that with an extremely prolonged and excruciating kiss on my forehead. That transformed the group's bewilderment into hysteria. They were all laughing now, so it could have been any of them, but one of the boys named Mike seemed to be laughing the hardest. To become a participant rather than the subject of the gag, I said to him that just because he had given me that card, he shouldn't think that I'd kiss him later. He gave me a slightly bewildered look and we all laughed. As I looked at Josh, I saw that he was finally smiling. "Well, I think that gift might be the winner, but you have a couple more to open." My mom slid another present in front of me. I was still feeling tremors of suppressed chuckles in my abdomen as I tore the colorful paper away. When I saw the gift, however, there was no more laughter in me to stifle. My spine dropped as I looked at what I had been given. It was a pair of walkie-talkies. "Well, go on! Show everyone!" my mother encouraged. I held them up and everyone seemed to approve, but as I turned my attention to Josh, I could see that he had turned a sickly shade of white. We locked eyes for a moment and then he turned and walked into the kitchen. As I watched him dial a number on the corded phone attached to the wall, my mom whispered in my ear that she knew that Josh and I didn't talk as much since one of the walkie-talkies had broken, so she thought I'd like it. I was filled with an intense appreciation of my mom's thoughtfulness, but this feeling was easily overpowered by the emotions resurrected by the returning memories I tried so hard to bury. While everyone was eating cake, I asked Josh whom he had called. He told me he wasn't feeling well, so he called his dad to come get him. I understood that he wanted to leave, but it was so hard to get Josh to come to my house that I, perhaps selfishly, wished that he would stay, despite how he was feeling. I told him that I wished we could hang out more. I extended one of the walkie-talkies to him, but he put his hand up in refusal. Dejected, I said, "Well, thanks for coming, I guess. I hope I'll see you before my next birthday." "I'm sorry. I'll try to call you back more often. I really will," he said. The conversation stalled as we waited by my door for his dad. The rest of the kids watched my mother's coworker perform magic. Rather than sound of amazement, most of the vocalizations were critical, but in good fun. Despite the haranguing, the magician and my mother seemed happy. Perhaps it was exactly what they had expected. I repeatedly opened my mouth as if words would just pour out and catch the interest of my friend, but I would silently shut it each time. I looked at his face. Josh seemed genuinely remorseful that he hadn't made more of an effort, but I thought I perceived some more brooding emotion behind his regret, though I couldn't tell what it was. As I stared at him, perhaps a little too intensely, his mood seemed suddenly bolstered by an idea that had struck him. He looked over to me and said that he knew what he'd get me for my birthday. It would take a while, but he thought that I would really like it. I dismissed it outright. I told him it wasn't a big deal and that I didn't need a gift. But he insisted. He seemed in better spirits and apologized for being such a drag at my party. He said he would call me soon, and when I said that he didn't have to treat me like a baby, he told me that if he didn't bother to call, then he wasn't worth being a friend with anyway. There was a knock at the door. Josh opened it and stepped out of my house, and next to his father and I could see Veronica sitting in the truck waiting impatiently. I thought about giving Josh a hug, but realized that might be embarrassing for the both of us, so I just gave him a low five. He apologized again as he walked off. He said that he was tired and that he hadn't been sleeping well, and I asked him why that was. He turned back toward me and waved goodbye as he answered my question. I think I've been sleepwalking. That was the last time I saw my friend, and a couple of months later, he was gone. Since I began this attempt to learn more about my childhood, the relationship between my mother and me had grown increasingly strained. Each time she would give me a piece of my past, I could feel myself becoming more complete. The structure of my autobiography finally falling into place with the connecting of milestones or the introduction of a never known fact. But I don't think I realized how much of herself she was losing in this process. Still, I thought we could take. Still, I thought we could take it. But maybe I was letting my wishes about the strength of our bond distort my perception of how strong it actually was. It's often the case that one cannot know the breaking point of a thing until that thing fractures. The last conversation that I had with my mother left me with what I'll now share with you. I'm not sure where this last discussion and all the ones that preceded it will leave me and my mom. I imagine that we will spend the rest of our lives attempting to repair what had taken a lifetime to build. She had put so much energy into keeping me safe, both physically and psychologically, but I think that the walls meant to insulate me from harm were also protecting her emotional stability. As the truth came pouring out the last time we spoke, I could hear a trembling in her voice that I think was a reverberation of the collapse of her world. I don't imagine my mother and I will talk very much anymore, and while there are still some things I don't understand, I think I know enough now. Why does it seem like every time I slide on this chair, it sounds like I'm farting when I'm not? After Josh disappeared, his parents had done all that they could do to find him. From the very first day, the police had suggested that they contact all the parents of the kids that knew Josh to see if he might be with them. They did this, of course, but no one had seen him or had any idea of where he might be. They placed notices in the newspaper and posted flyers all around the old neighborhood. They even solicited message boards and chat rooms in missing children networks. The police had been unable to turn over any new information about Josh's whereabouts, despite the fact that they had received several anonymous phone calls from a woman urging them to compare this case with the stalking case that had been opened about 6 years before. One day, however, they got a call. The person said that he had seen Josh. Josh's father sat down on the couch with his wife. Holding a pen to a pad of paper, he asked the caller where he had seen the boy. The caller said, "In Florida." And the father pressed further. "Where? Where in Florida did you see him?" The caller yelled, "At Disney World!" Laughed, and hung up. His wife was clutching his free hand right, waiting for the information. She asked what the person had said, and Josh's father tore the piece of paper that read, "Florida Diz," out of the pad and crumpled it up. Nothing. It was nothing. I always hate calls like that. I just want to pause real quick and say that's kind of bullshit that pisses me off. You got parents who are worried sick about their child, and you're gonna pull a stunt like that? I wouldn't give a damn who that is. Fuck you. I'd be fucking pissed. Livid. These calls persisted for months. People from all over the country would call and offer fake tips or brutal mockery. There weren't many of these calls, maybe a dozen, but there were enough. They couldn't just change the number. Josh might call, or at least someone who had actually seen him, so they transferred the phone number to a friend who offered to act as a buffer from these kinds of callers. The friend said that she would press anyone who asked about Josh, but otherwise she would just treat it as an ordinary wrong number. She was a good friend to them, and my mother struggled to remember her name, but I already knew it from the time that I had talked to her. Her name was Claire. Josh's mother was not as strong as her husband was. If her grip on the world loosened when her son vanished, it broke when Veronica died. She had seen many people die at the hospital, but there is no amount of desensitization that can fortify a person against the death of her own child. She would visit Veronica twice a day since she was recuperating at a different hospital, once before her shift and once afterward. On the day Veronica died, her mother was late leaving work, and by the time she arrived at her daughter's hospital, Veronica had already passed. This was too much for her, and over the next couple of weeks, she became increasingly more unstable. She stopped going to work, but unlike the leave of absence she had taken almost 3 years before when Josh had disappeared, this time she had nothing to focus her attention on except her own pain. She would sometimes wander outside yelling for both Josh and Veronica to come home, and there were several times her husband found her staggering around my old neighborhood in the middle of the night, half clothed and frantically searching for her son and daughter. Due to his wife's mental deterioration, Josh's dad could no longer travel for work, and so he began taking construction jobs that were less lucrative in an effort to be closer to home. When they began expanding my old neighborhood more, about 3 months after Veronica died, Josh's dad applied for literally every position that was vacant. He was hired. Although he was qualified to lead the build sites, he took a job as a laborer. He would help build the frame and clean up the sites and do whatever else needed to be done. He even took odd jobs that would occasionally come up, mowing lawns, repairing fences, anything to keep from traveling. When they began clearing the woods in the area next to the tributary in order to transform the land into the inhabitable property, Josh's dad was tasked with the responsibility of leveling the recently deforested lot. He accepted it eagerly as this job guaranteed him at least several weeks of work close to home. On the fourth day, he arrived at a spot he could not level. Each time he would drive over it with the machine, the patch of land would remain lower than all the surrounding earth. Frustrated, he got off the tractor to survey the area. He was tempted to simply pack more dirt into the depression, but he knew that would only be an aesthetic and temporary solution. He had worked construction for years, and he knew what and he knew hold on a second. And he knew that root systems from large trees had been recently cut down would often decompose, leaving weaknesses in the soil below that would manifest as weaknesses in the foundations above. Part of his motivation to do the job thoroughly was out of self-interest. With any luck, he would be contracted to help with the building, or at least placing of the future homes on this property, so he didn't want to sabotage himself. But this was only a small part of his reasoning. Ultimately, he was a builder. Ignoring the problem was simply not a possibility. He weighed his options and elected to dig a little with a shovel in case the problem was shallow enough to fix without needing the backhoe that he would have to retrieve from another site. I asked my mother where the site was, but it was almost a rhetorical question. I knew where it was. I had been to this spot before the soil had broken and before it had been filled in. I had fallen in that hole when I was 10 years old. I felt a tightening in my chest as my mother continued. He stabbed his shovel into the dirt to test its consistency, and to his surprise and disappointment, the shovel had disappeared almost entirely below the earth. The soil was weak, and while that would make it easier to move, he had not anticipated what might be such an extensive delay so soon into the job. Pulling back onto the wooden handle, he moved a small mound of dirt off the side. off, okay, I was trying to find my place, but we got it now. I'll start over on the sentence. Pulling back on the wooden handle, he moved a small amount of dirt a small mound of dirt off to the side and began his project. Before too long, he had dug a small hole about 3 feet down. When he reset his position and drove the metal blade into the earth, a tremor traveled up the pole and into his arms. His shovel had collided with something hard. He smashed his shovel against it repeatedly in an attempt to gauge the thickness of the root and the density of the network, when suddenly his shovel plunged through the resistance. Confused, he dug the hole wider. After about half an hour of excavating, he found himself standing on a brown blanket that was stretched across and stapled to a large box about 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. Our minds work hard to avoid dissonance. If we had to believe strongly enough, our minds will forcefully reject conflicting evidence so that we can maintain the integrity of our understanding of the world. And I'm getting tired of dropping my freaking bookmark. I might need to buy me another bookmark, honestly. I might just do that. But I don't know where to buy one, though. That's the problem. Or even get one, for that matter. But anyway. uh... Up until the very next moment, despite all reason would have indicated, despite the fact that some small but suffocated part of him understood what was supporting his weight, this man believed, he knew, his son was still alive. My mom received a call at 6 o'clock in the evening. She knew who it was, but she couldn't understand what he was saying. However, what she did comprehend made her leave immediately. Down here. Now. Son. Please, God. When she arrived, she found Josh's dad sitting perfectly still with his back to the hole. He was holding the shovel so tightly it seemed that it might snap, and he was staring straight ahead with the eyes that had no life or light in them. My mother approached him slowly and tried several times to get his attention, but he wouldn't respond to any of her words. He only reacted when she tried, with delicate and hesitant hands, to take the shovel from him. When she touched the shovel, his vice-like grip on the handle tightened, forcing all the blood out of his fingers to the point that they were as white as bone. He dragged his eyes slowly to hers and just said, "I don't understand." He repeated this as if he had forgotten all of the words, and my mother could hear him still muttering it as she walked past both him and scrapes of broken wood to look into the hole. My mother told me that she wished she had gouged her eyes out before she faced downward into the crater, and I told her that I knew what she was about to say and that she need not continue. I looked at her face. It was expressing a look of such intense despair that it caused my stomach to turn. It struck me that she had known of this for almost 10 years and was hoping that she'd never have to tell me. I imagine that she made a firm decision all those years ago to never share this information, and as we sat there at the same weathered table that had forever been the meeting spot for our talks, I felt a twinge of guilt for forcing her to break the promise that she made to herself, because she never intended to tell me. She never came up with the proper arrangement of words to describe what she saw. As I sit here now, I met with the same difficulty of articulation, but for different reasons. Josh was dead. His face was sunken in and contorted in such a way that it was as if the misery and hopelessness of all the world had been transferred to it. The assaulting smell of decay rose from the crypt, and my mother had to cover her nose and mouth to keep from vomiting. His skin was cracked, almost crocodilian, and a stream of blood followed these lines and dried on his face while pooling and staining the wood around his head. My mother wanted to look away. She wanted to move her eyes, even if just a little bit, so that she could see something else. Something else. Anything else. But she couldn't. Her eyes had locked with Josh's, which lay open and facing up out of the tomb, and although he couldn't return her gaze, it felt as if he were looking directly at her. She said by the look of him that he had not been long dead, but she couldn't hazard a guess because she simply had no reference. Selfishly and horribly, she wished that more time had passed before that day, so that time and nature could have brought the mercy of degradation to erase the pain and terror that was now etched into his face. She said that it felt as if he knew she'd be right there, that he had been waiting for her to enter his line of sight, his open mouth offering an all too late plea for help to ears that could do nothing for him. She forcefully covered her eyes to break the stare and attempted to confront the scene as a whole, but the rest of his body wasn't visible. Someone else was covering it. He was large and lay face down on top of Josh. As my mother's mind stretched itself to take in what her eyes were attempting to tell her, she became aware of the significance of the way in which he laid. He was holding Josh. Their legs lay frozen by death, but entangled like vines in some lush tropical forest. One arm rested under Josh's neck only to wrap around his body so that they might lay closer still, while the other arm lay limp with a bent elbow against the wood, his fingers entangled in Josh's hair. The man's back was covered in dirt, and as she looked back to the area near Josh's head, ashamedly avoiding his gaze, she could see that some of this scattered earth had mixed with the blood and formed mud that lay still wet in the damp casket. As the sun passed through the trees, its light reflected off something pinned to Josh's shirt. My mother stopped to one knee and raised the collar of her shirt over her nose so that she might block out the smell while she attempted to train her vision on the object rather than Josh's face. When she saw what had caught the sunlight, her legs abandoned her and she nearly fell into the tomb. It was a picture. It was a picture of me as a child. Gasping and trembling, she staggered backwards and collided with Josh's father, who still sat facing away from the hole. She understood why he had called her now, but she could not bring herself to tell him what she had kept from everyone for all these years. Not that the information could do any good now anyway. Josh's family never knew about the night I had woken up in the woods. They never knew about the Polaroids. They never knew about the note that she had found on my pillow. They never knew the real reason we had moved out of our old home with such haste. She had moved us into a new house to protect my life, and she had kept all the things a secret so that life might be a normal one. She had talked to the police. She knew now that she should have talked to Josh's parents, but there was nothing to say anymore. As she sat there resting her back against Josh's father, he spoke. I can't tell my wife. I can't tell her that our boy. His speech stuttered in fits as he pressed his wet face into his dirt cast hands. She couldn't bear it. After a moment he stood up, still shuddering, and lumbered toward the grave. With a final sob he stepped down into the coffin and positioned himself over the dead man's body. Josh's dad was a big man, but not as big as the man in the box was. However, he seemed unable to grasp this fact. He grabbed the back of the man's collar and pulled hard. As if he intended to throw the man out of the grave in a singular motion. But the collar ripped, and the body fell back down on top of his son. As this happened, when the air remained in Josh's lungs, he was violently forced out through his mouth, and the father shrieked as he both watched and heard his son's last empty breath. You motherfucker! He grabbed the man by the shoulders and heaved him back until he was off Josh completely. With one final straining motion, he shoved the man in until the body sat awkwardly but upright against the wall of the grave. Josh's father rested his hands on his knees and breathed heavily and painfully as he looked down at his only son. He grunted with anger and turned his attention to the man, and my mother could see the rage disappear from his eyes as something else replaced it. He staggered back a step, and then another. Oh God. Oh God. No. No. Please God. Please God. No. No. No! In a struggling but powerful movement, he lifted and pushed the corpse of the man completely out of the ground. And as he did this, there was the distinct sound of glass first hitting and then rolling against the wood. It was a bottle. He picked it up and absently handed it to my mother. It was ether. Oh, Josh, he sobbed as he cradled his son. My boy, my baby boy. Why is there so much blood? What did he do to you? As my mother looked at the man who had now lay facing upwards, a chill came over her as she realized that she was facing, for the first time, the person who had haunted our lives for over a decade. Everything about our lives had changed since this person had entered it, and she had lost so much sleep thinking about this man. When she pictured him, whether in waking life or a dream, he was always evil and always terrifying. The cries of Josh's father seemed to confirm her worst fears. But as she stared at his face, she thought that this didn't look like who she had imagined at all. This was just a man. As she looked up on his frozen expression, it actually looked serene. The corners of his lips were turned up only slightly. She saw that he was smiling. This wasn't the expected smile of a maniac from a film or horror story. It wasn't the smile of a demon or the smile of a fiend. This was the smile of contentment or satisfaction. It was a smile of bliss. It was a smile of love. When she looked down from his face, she saw a tremendous wound on his neck from where the skin had been ripped out. She realized that this wound must have been the source of the blood that strained Josh's neck and the wood upon which his head rested. Initially, she was relieved by the realization that the blood had not been Josh's. Perhaps he suffered less, and in a strange way, this small comfort amidst the madness that set her slightly at ease. She looked to Josh's father, who sat in the coffin, still holding his son to his chest, and wondered if she should tell him. She wondered if this tiny consolation was worth distracting him from his own thoughts, whatever they might be. She drew her eyes away for a moment to think, and they lingered on the scraps of wood that lay scattered to one side of the hole, many of them still connected to a large brown blanket. She recognized that these pieces of wood must have been the top of the box that Josh's father had torn away before calling her. Her drifting eyes and wandering thoughts both suddenly focused on what she saw in the debris, and she realized that she had been brought wrong to hope for any comfort now, in this place. Her mind raced to make excuses for this object's existence, but she was too tired to listen to anything but the truth anymore. She stared at the metal handle that was screwed into one of the boards of wood. She brought a hand up to her mouth and whispered, almost as if she was afraid to remind the world of what had happened. They were alive. Josh must have bitten the man's neck in a desperate attempt to get free, and although the man had died, Josh wasn't strong enough to move him. When my mother realized this, she began to cry at the thought of how long he might have laid there and how he must have felt. She shuddered at the thought that he wouldn't have even been able to see in that dark place. She crouched down beside the man and looked through his pockets for some kind of identification, but she only found a small piece of paper. On a, on a, on it was a stick figure drawing of a man holding hands with a small boy, and next to the boy were initials. She told me that the initials were mine. She asked me if I understood what it might mean, and I lied to her and said that I did not. As Josh's father carried his son out of the grave, my mom slid the piece of paper into her pocket and stood up. He was muttering that his son's hair had been dyed, but he wasn't talking to my mother. It seemed almost as if he had forgotten that she was there. When she looked at Josh, she understood what his father was saying. Josh's hair was now dark brown, though it looked almost black as it clung to itself, cemented by blood. Josh's dad delicately laid his boy on the soft dirt and began gently pressing his hands against his son's pants to feel his pockets. My mother noticed that Josh was oddly dressed. His clothes were all far too small for a boy his size. As the father applied pressure to his son's left pocket, there was a crickle. Carefully, he retrieved a folded piece of paper from Josh's pocket and slowly unfolded it, not knowing what it might be. As he was returning the paper to its original shape, a small key fell from its folds and onto the dirt. He picked it up and looked at it as if he expected it to say something to him. After a moment, he pushed it into his front pocket before returning his attention to the paper. He studied it but was vexed. With no immediately meaningful information to be gained from it, he handed the piece of paper to my mother. She nervously accepted it, but she didn't recognize it either. When I asked her what it was, she told me that it was a map, and I felt my heart shatter. Josh was finishing the map that must have been his idea for my birthday present. He had resumed the expedition on his own. That was our first great adventure, and he had decided to finish it for me. For us. Tears began to stream down out of my eyes as I learned this, and I found myself desperately hoping that he hadn't been taking while working on it. Despite everything that had happened, he had kept the map in his pocket for almost 3 years. She heard Josh's father grunt angrily and looked to see him pushing the man's body back into the ground. As he walked back toward the machine that had found his spot for him, he put his hand on a canister of gasoline and paused with his back toward my mother. You should go. I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do? It's not your fault. It was me. I did this. You can't think like that. There was nothing. I did this! He roared. There was silence for a long time. He seemed to be searching for the right words. Or maybe he was just searching for a decision about whether he wanted to say them at all. Finally, he continued, his voice flat with almost no emotion at all. Goddamn, pants quit sliding on my chair. About a month ago, I was cleaning up the sign on the new development, a block over, when a guy approached me. He asked if I wanted to make some extra money. Well, with my wife now working, I'd just take about any job, so I asked him about it. He said that some kids had dug a bunch of holes on his property and he offered me $100 to fill them in. I told him that was no problem, just tell me where and when. He said that he wanted to take some pictures for the insurance company first, but if I came back after 8 p.m. the next day, that would be fine. He said I'd have no problem finding the holes. I thought this guy was a sucker since I knew clearing the lot was coming up for the crew I was on, so someone would have had to do it anyway. I actually felt bad for taking his money. It didn't even look like he'd have $100, but he put the bill in my hand, and I did the job the next night. I'd been so exhausted I didn't even think about it after it was done. I didn't think about it. There was a long pause as he seemed to lose control of his voice. I didn't think about it until today, when I pulled that same guy off of my son. He pointed at the grave, and his emotions finally broke free again, as tears fell from his eyes and mucus from his nose. He paid me $100 so that I would bury him with my boy. It was as if saying it aloud forced him to accept what had happened, and he collapsed onto the ground in tears. My mother could think of nothing to say, so she stood there in silence. for about what felt like a lifetime as she tried to comprehend what he had just told her. She knew that he wouldn't tell his wife about any of this. My mother knew that this would be the only time when he could reach out for any comfort at all. She knelt down and held him while he cried for his son. Finally, she asked what he would do about Josh, where he would take him, but all he said was, his final resting place won't be here with this monster. He rose and stepped delicately around his boy while he walked toward the grave with the canister of gasoline in his hand. My mother left what used to be my old woods, but what was now just a mausoleum with no wall. But was now just a mausoleum with no walls. As she looked back when she reached her car, she could see black smoke billowing and diffusing against the amber sky, and she hoped against all hope that Josh's parents would be okay. When my When my mother had finished her story, we sat in silence for a long time. I wanted to feel anger or agony, but I felt nothing but a hollow emptiness inside. As we sat there, I realized that Josh's parents had called my mother when Josh went missing. She must have lied to them the same way that she lied to me. Josh's parents must still believe to this day that their son really ran away. I stood up to leave. There was only one question that I had for my mother. Only one thing that I wanted to know from her, but she couldn't answer it. I don't know why I expected that she could. I left my mom's house without saying much else. I told her that I loved her and that I would talk to her soon, but I don't know what soon means for us now. I got in my car and left. As I drove, that stupid riddle about going into the woods come back into my mind, and that was enough to make me feel again. I remember Josh and me talking about it in those woods nearly half my lifetime ago. I cried so hard that I had to pull my car over, and I again asked the question that my mother had been unable to answer. I asked it aloud, even though no one was around to answer it but me. Why Josh? It was supposed to be me. It had always been me. So why wasn't it when it mattered the most? Why did I wake up in the winter woods when I was a child instead of being entombed in them? Why couldn't it have stopped them with me? But I'll never know the answer to this question. I'll never know why he just left me there. There's no one I can ask now. Maybe he just couldn't do it. He tried, but in the end he was just too weak to take me. As I sat there in my car on the side of the road, I struggled to breathe between my exhausted sobs. I collapsed on the steering wheel and whimpered that I wished that he had been stronger. I understand now. As the story became clearer with each detail revealed through the conversations with my mother, I had watched the pieces all fall into place, but I still couldn't understand why it had all stopped so long ago. Why it had all simply ended. Sitting in my car that night, I saw it all clearly for the first time. As an adult, I could see the connection that were lost on a child who tends to see the world in snapshots rather than as a sequence. The picture was complete, but I wished I had never seen it at all. I left the gas station and drove the rest of the way home and thought, which is all that's left for me to do anymore. I thought about Josh. I think about Josh. I loved him then, and I love him even still. I miss him more now that I know I'll never see him again, and I find myself wishing that I had hugged him the last time I saw him. I wish that he could have stayed at my birthday party longer that day, even if we didn't say another word to one another. We could have just sat there. That would have been nice. I think about Josh's parents, how much they had lost and how quickly that loss had come. They were good people, kind people. The father had called my mother that terrible day so that she could keep me safe, but no one had called him to help him protect Josh. His parents don't know about my connection to any of this, but I could never look them in the eyes now. We still live in the same town, and I would every day and I worry every day that I'll run into them somewhere. I find myself hoping that I don't see them, and I feel sick when I have that thought. I think about Veronica. I had only really come to know her later in my life, but for those few brief weeks, I think I had really loved her. I think about my mother. She tried so hard to protect me. She had done everything she could possibly do to keep me safe. She was stronger than I will ever be. I think about what our lives might be like now if I had just let my balloon go with Chris's, or even a single second sooner or later than I did. Maybe someone else would have found it, and everyone would be okay. Maybe I'd still have my friend, and his parents would still have a son. Josh had been missing for almost 3 years, almost a fifth of his life. I was trying to pretend that I don't know what that man might have done with Josh for all that time. Just like I tried to pretend that maybe Josh wasn't in the passenger seat the night Veronica was hit. I find myself pretending a lot now. But mostly, I think about Josh. Sometimes I wish that he'd never sat across from me that day in kindergarten. That I'd never known what it was like to have a real friend. Sometimes I like to dream that he's in a better place now, but that's only a dream and I know that. The world is a cruel place, made crueler still by man. There would be no justice for my friend. No final confrontation. No vengeance. It's been over for almost a decade now, for everyone but me. I miss you, Josh. I'm sorry that you chose me, but I'll always cherish my memories of you. We were explorers. We were adventurers. We were friends. The end will take care of itself. And here is a thing here. It's a deputy field report. This is the very picture that is on here. I'll try to read it, but I'll try to be terrible on it. Let's see. Deputy field report. No person arrested. Offense stalking. Completion number 49-7. No, that's 3. No address, sex, race, date of birth. They do have the address of Sam, district, witness. They have a good number of things that were marked over for confidentiality. Blank stated that her 6-year-old son Blank had launched a balloon as a school project. Attached to it was a letter and $1 bill marked for stamps. Letter requested the finder send a letter to him at his school. Blank along with his pictures. He has received 48 photos, but no letters since Blank. Yesterday, he and his friend Josh had a snow cone stand in his front yard. He found a dollar bill marked for stamps in the cache. He looked at the photos he had and realized he was in many of them. Mother and her and he was the focus of the pictures of or appeared in 33 of them. Today in the mail, his mother found a photo of him and Josh taken in the woods by their home. From the clothing they had on, the photo was taken yesterday. All photos were seized to be processed for prints. Any appears to be a case of stalking in a suspect's home, in a suspect's known, in no and no suspecting something. It can't. No suspects known. However, redacted. That was Penpal. That was Penpal. Now, what do I think of this book, personally? I very much enjoyed reading this horror book. Amongst one of my absolute favorite horror books I have ever read. And when I say this book gave me Stephen King vibes, I mean this book gave me Stephen King vibes. To the point where he was being descriptive about what happened. Right down to from the detail of what happened with him in all these situations that he was involved in, to the pictures that he was taking. Well, that main one that was the last picture that was ultimately taken. It was very descriptive, and it was very creepy and scary at certain points. For me, the scariest moment in this book will have to be that moment when he finds out that these pictures had to deal with him specifically. His mother was involved in some of them, but it was mainly about the narrator. And then you have that moment where you find out that this man ended up burying himself with the narrator's friend Josh. To me, this really was a creepypasta feel. And I very much enjoyed reading this book on the grounds of how terrifying, how frightening, how psychologically creepy it is. But with that said, I would say this book is one of my absolute favorite books of the horror genre. Now, as you guys may have, now it's time for me to reveal the next book that I'll be reading. Now, just like last time, I'll be talking about it on my community post, but initially, I was thinking of doing this book right here, which is underneath these names right here. This book was titled Her Perfect Family. I was thinking of doing that. Like I initially said the last time when I was reading something, I initially was saying that when I made that poll. But there was something that I realized. And this was thought to me even before I read this book. I was instantly thinking of what good would a horror book, what good would it be for reading books on a month that is centered around scary and or frightening moments. So I was thinking, what would be a good book? What would be a good author to read the horror books of? And I knew straight away who I was going to read, which book I was going to read, and which author it is. How could we have a special monthly reading of a special reading of a book based on horror if we're not going to read a book by the horror master himself, Stephen King? And honestly, I already found the book I wanted to read of his work. This book right here. Because I have watched the movie that this book is that's based off of this book. I've watched it before, and it is, in my opinion, one of the greatest horror movie adaptations. Well, any kind of a movie adaptation of any Stephen King book. Now, I haven't seen them all, and I'm not saying it's the best one, But I do think it's one of my absolute favorite horror movies. Now, what book am I thinking of reading? What book am I going to subject myself to with Stephen King? Ladies and gentlemen, Misery. Oh, I'm gonna have a grand old time with this book. Wish me luck, guys, because there's a part in this book that I know is gonna happen, and it's gonna be crazy right then and there. And if you've read the book, you know exactly where I'm going with this. But don't spoil it for anybody if you have. In any event, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and until next time, this is Forrest Walpole signing off.